There's a person at the edge of every room who seems to be doing nothing, but is actually doing everything. They're not scrolling their phone or checking the time. They're not waiting for someone to rescue them from their solitude. They're watching, listening, processing the entire emotional ecosystem around them with the intensity of a scientist studying a new species. You might mistake them for shy, aloof, or disconnected, but here's the truth. They're not waiting to be invited into the conversation. They're already deeply engaged in the most important dialogue happening in that space, the one between their mind and the world around them. They are the wallflowers, and they're not hiding from life. They're studying it. Inside the mind of the person who prefers to watch lives, a sophisticated recording system that most people can't imagine. Their brain doesn't just capture moments, it archives entire emotional landscapes. Think of most minds like smartphones taking quick snapshots, but their mind operates like a high-definition video camera with a zoom lens, recording not just what people say, but how they say it. Not just facial expressions, but the micro movements that reveal what someone is really feeling. They notice the slight tension in your voice when you mention your job, the way your shoulders shift when someone specific enters the room, the pause that lasts half a second too long before you answer a simple question. They're cataloging information that others miss completely. This isn't nosiness, this is depth processing. It's a neurological trait where the mind automatically analyzes information more thoroughly before responding. Where others see a simple conversation, they see layers of meaning, subtext, and emotional undercurrents that need to be understood. But here's where it gets complicated. This thoroughness comes with a cost. While everyone else is participating in real time, they're still processing what happened 3 exchanges ago. By the time they've fully understood the emotional temperature of a moment, the conversation has moved on. They're always operating on a slight delay, not because they're slow, but because they're being careful. Their mind maps entire landscapes before taking a single step. They need to understand the terrain, identify potential hazards, locate safe spaces, and plan multiple exit routes before they feel secure enough to engage. This creates what psychologists call rumination, but it's not the destructive kind, it's thoughtful rumination. They're not stuck in loops of self-criticism. They're committed to understanding complexity before acting on incomplete information. Their internal world often feels richer and more satisfying than external interactions. While others are having surface-level exchanges about weekend plans and weather patterns, they're having profound conversations with themselves about human nature, the meaning behind people's choices, the patterns that connect seemingly unrelated events. Silence isn't emptiness. It's the sound of deep processing. But this gift comes with exhausting vigilance. They can't turn off their environmental scanning system. They're constantly reading the room, monitoring emotional shifts, tracking conversational patterns, predicting where tensions might surface. It's like being the designated driver for everyone's emotions, staying alert and sober while others relax into spontaneity. They notice things that others miss, which means they also worry about things that others ignore. They see the friend who's struggling behind their smile. They catch the family dynamics that everyone pretends don't exist. They observe the workplace tensions that are building toward inevitable conflict. Their awareness becomes a burden because once you see the complexity, you can't unsee it. Once you understand how much is happening beneath every interaction, casual conversation starts to feel impossibly shallow. They're not antisocial. They're overwhelmed by how social everything actually is. Every gathering is an intricate dance of personalities, histories, insecurities, and unspoken needs. They see the choreography that others are unconsciously performing. This is why they often prefer the edge of the room, not because they don't want to participate, but because participation requires choosing which layer of meaning to engage with. It requires ignoring most of what they're perceiving in order to focus on the simple surface exchange. From the edge, they can see everything, the whole pattern, the complete picture. They can appreciate the complexity without having to pretend it doesn't exist. Their mind isn't broken or deficient. It's calibrated differently. It's designed for depth rather than speed, for understanding rather than quick response, for wisdom rather than wit. The world tells them this is a problem to be fixed. But what if it's actually a gift to be understood? There's a profound difference between being excluded and choosing to observe. The wallflower has discovered something that most people miss: the power of conscious non-participation. From the edge of the room, they can see patterns that participants can't. When you're in the middle of a conversation, you only see your piece of the puzzle. But from their position, they witness the entire mosaic. They watch how different personalities affect the group dynamic. They observe who speaks over whom, who defers, who performs, who retreats. They've learned to trade the momentary rush of participation for the lasting clarity of detachment. This isn't passive withdrawal, it's active observation. They're not disengaged, they're differently engaged. While others are focused on their next response, their clever comeback, their moment to shine, the wallflower is studying the deeper currents moving beneath the surface. They see the person who's trying too hard to be funny because they're uncomfortable with silence. They notice the individual who dominates conversations because they can't tolerate not being the center of attention. They observe the one who agrees with everything because conflict feels too dangerous to navigate. These observations aren't judgments, though others often mistake them for criticism. The wallflower sees these patterns with compassion, recognizing them as human strategies for connection and safety. But seeing so clearly makes it harder to participate in the dance when you can see all the steps everyone is unconsciously performing. Their reluctance to join isn't about fear of people, it's about fear of superficiality. Small talk feels like emotional waste when your mind craves meaningful exchange. They hunger for conversations that explore ideas, examine feelings, investigate the mysteries of human experience. But most social interactions operate on a completely different frequency. "How was your weekend?" isn't really a question seeking genuine information. "Nice weather we're having" isn't actually about meteorology. These are social rituals, connection attempts disguised as information exchange. The wallflower understands this, but their mind rebels against participating in conversations that feel hollow. They'd rather have one profound exchange than 50 pleasant ones. They'd rather sit in comfortable silence than fill the air with words that don't mean anything. They'd rather be alone with their thoughts than surrounded by people having thoughts they can't share. This creates a cruel paradox. They crave connection more deeply than most people because they experience it so rarely. But their standards for meaningful connection are so high that most interactions fail to meet them. They become connoisseurs of depth in a world that serves mostly surface-level experiences. The silence that others find uncomfortable, they find necessary. It's not empty space waiting to be filled with noise. It's processing time, reflection space, the pause between observation and understanding where wisdom gets distilled from raw experience. They've learned that not every moment needs to be filled with words. Not every silence needs to be rescued with conversation. Not every gathering requires their active participation to be valuable. Their presence is their contribution. Their attention is their gift. Their careful observation is how they show up for the people they care about. But here's where the pain lives. The world interprets their conscious non-participation as rejection. Family members think they're antisocial. Colleagues assume they're uninterested. Friends worry they're depressed or angry. The wallflower finds themselves constantly explaining a choice that feels natural to them, but appears problematic to others. They're forced to justify their way of being in a world that values extroversion, quick responses, and visible engagement above quiet presence and thoughtful observation. They begin to question whether their natural way of moving through the world is actually wrong. Whether their need for depth is actually selfishness. Whether their preference for observation is actually avoidance. The judgment they fear most isn't from others. It's the judgment they place on themselves for being different in a world that rewards sameness. But what if their difference isn't a deficit? What if their conscious non-participation is exactly what the world needs more of? This preference for observation didn't emerge from nowhere. It was carefully cultivated in childhood, planted in soil that should have nurtured confidence, but instead grew hypervigilance. Many wallflowers were once the overlooked child, not neglected in dramatic ways, but consistently passed over in family conversations. Their insights were dismissed as too serious for their age. Their observations were labeled as overthinking. Their questions were brushed aside because adults were too busy to engage with a mind that saw complexity where others saw simplicity. They learned early that their natural way of processing the world was somehow problematic. that their need to understand before participating was a character flaw rather than a cognitive strength, that their careful consideration was slowness rather than thoroughness. But here's where the deeper conditioning happened. They discovered that the world was unpredictable in ways that felt dangerous to their sensitive system. Parents who were loving one day and irritable the next, teachers who praised creativity on Tuesday and criticized it on Thursday, friends who included them in games until someone more interesting came along. Their young mind couldn't make sense of these inconsistencies, so it developed a strategy: constant environmental monitoring. If they could just pay close enough attention, if they could read the signs correctly, maybe they could predict when safety would turn to threat. They became the family scout, always scanning the horizon for emotional weather patterns, always alert for the subtle shifts that preceded storms, always ready to adjust their behavior based on the temperature of the room. This hypervigilance wasn't paranoia, it was adaptation. In environments where emotional safety felt conditional, where acceptance seemed to depend on reading social cues correctly, observation became survival. Think of them as the child who learned that their job was to keep everyone comfortable, not through performance or people-pleasing, but through careful attention to everyone else's needs and moods. They became emotional meteorologists, tracking the atmospheric pressure of family dynamics. But this role came with a cost. When you spend your childhood monitoring everyone else's emotional state, you never learn to relax into your own experience. You never develop the luxury of spontaneity, because spontaneity requires not having to worry about how your actions will affect the emotional ecosystem around you. They learned that being invisible was safer than being seen, that staying quiet protected them from criticism, judgment, or the overwhelming responsibility of managing other people's reactions to their thoughts and feelings. Some wallflowers grew up in chaotic environments where observation was literally a safety mechanism, where paying attention to adult moods meant the difference between a peaceful evening and a house full of tension, where reading the signs correctly could prevent explosions that felt too big for a small person to handle. Others grew up in families that valued intellectual achievement, but struggled with emotional expression, where thoughts were welcomed, but feelings were uncomfortable, where being smart was praised, but being sensitive was seen as weakness. They learned to retreat into their minds because their minds felt safer than their hearts. They discovered that thinking was more acceptable than feeling, that analysis was more valued than intuition, that understanding was more rewarded than experiencing. The profound irony is that many wallflowers developed their observational skills as a way to connect with others. They studied people so carefully because they wanted to understand them, to find ways to bridge the gap between their internal experience and the external world. But somewhere along the way, the studying became a substitute for connecting. The understanding became a replacement for participating. The observation became a way to feel close to others without risking the vulnerability that real closeness requires. They convinced themselves that watching was enough, that understanding people from a distance was the same as knowing them up close, that their careful attention was a form of love, even when it never translated into direct engagement. The child who learned to survive by staying alert grew into an adult who forgot how to rest, who forgot that not every situation requires strategic thinking, who forgot that sometimes the most profound connection happens not through understanding, but through simple presence. The healing doesn't begin with forcing yourself into the center of the room. It begins with something far more radical, validating your own way of being in the world. Your silence isn't a problem to be solved. It's wisdom being carefully prepared. The revolution starts with reframing your position. You're not on the sidelines because you're afraid. You're there because you've chosen depth over superficiality, understanding over performance, presence over participation. This doesn't mean permanent withdrawal. It means intentional engagement. Think of it as micro-participation, small, deliberate acts of connection that honor both your need for depth and the world's invitation to engage. One thoughtful question instead of constant chatter. One moment of genuine eye contact instead of forced conversation. One authentic response instead of reflexive agreement. You don't have to become someone else to connect with others. You have to become more yourself. Practice trusting your own processing speed. When someone asks you a question, Resist the urge to fill the pause with meaningless words. Let the silence exist while your mind does what it does best. Considers, analyzes, formulates a response that actually means something. That pause isn't awkwardness. It's intelligence in action. Learn to distinguish between meaningful connection and social obligation. You don't owe everyone access to your thoughts. You don't have to participate in every conversation to prove your social worth. You can choose where to invest your emotional energy based on what feels authentic rather than what feels expected. Set boundaries around shallow interactions while remaining open to profound ones. It's okay to politely decline small talk while enthusiastically engaging in discussions about ideas, feelings, or experiences that matter to you. The most radical act is refusing to apologize for your depth. Stop explaining why you need time to think. Stop justifying your preference for meaningful conversation. Stop treating your observational nature like a character flaw that needs correction. Your way of moving through the world isn't wrong, it's different. And different is exactly what a surface-level world desperately needs. When you do choose to speak, let it come from the place of careful consideration that makes you who you are. Your words carry weight because they're not thrown around carelessly. Your insights matter because they come from genuine observation rather than quick reaction. The world doesn't need you to become more talkative. It needs you to trust that your thoughtful presence is enough. Your preference for watching isn't a weakness, it's a superpower disguised as sensitivity. You are the depth in a shallow world, the pause in a frantic conversation, the wisdom that waits for the right moment to emerge. The world needs people willing to see what others miss, to think before speaking, to choose meaning over noise. Your silence isn't absence, it's the sound of understanding being born.